So, in today's review, I want to go over this story about Joshua Wong being sentenced to 13 months in prison. Now, Joshua Wong was one of the main leaders of the Hong Kong protests that, for years had been plaguing that city and a thorn in Beijing's side. And now it looks like Beijing has finally gotten the upper hand. The protests have, for all intents and purposes, stopped. And now there's these court cases going through and jail time being handed out to the protest leaders. So this was Joshua Wong getting 13 months. This is this RT article for organizing unauthorized assembly. This was outside of a police station. So that was just one of many things that Joshua Wong did during all of these protests. And I'm sure there's probably going to be other cases that he's going to have to face. Now, there was another one of these protest leaders, Agnes Chow. She's facing further charges under the national security law, accused of colluding with foreign forces, which, if she is found guilty, could carry a life sentence. And now we already know how the West is going to react. They're going to wring their hands and beat their chest and say how outrageous this is that these jail sentences are being handed out to these pro-democracy protest leaders. But of course, there was nothing democratic about anything they were doing. As I like to point out, democracy is a process of self-determination. Everything Joshua Wong and his cohorts were doing was being funded and directed out of Washington, D.C. So that's not self-determination. That's determined by Washington through people like Joshua Wong. And, I just want to go over some of these older articles. This was from 2019, September 15th, 2019. Hong Kong activist seeks U.S. support for pro-democracy protests. And if we go down here, Wong, who spoke to Reuters in New York ahead of a planned visit to Washington, led Hong Kong's pro-democracy umbrella movement in 2014. And this is about him saying that he's seeking the support of U.S. lawmakers for the demands of his fellow protesters who have led months of street demonstrations, including a call for free election. I think Reuters needs to hire some better editors here. But so last year he literally went to Washington, D.C. and openly asked for help. But even before that, for years, him and everyone else in that movement were being funded by the U.S. government and backed and supported by the U.S. government. And I don't know if people remember or not, but there was this Oslo Freedom Forum, and the BBC did a story on that, and they actually admitted that the Hong Kong protests were planned and organized at the Oslo Freedom Forum. This Western organization trained them and sent them back to Hong Kong to stir up trouble. Now, here, this is actually this is Joshua Wong in Washington, D.C., testifying in front of Congress. So, I mean, this is pro-democracy. This is a guy who was leading a movement that was essentially calling for independence for Hong Kong, and yet they were entirely dependent on the United States. It was like a throwback to British colonization. They're going over to the West, asking them to hold their hand and get them through this. And that wasn't the first time Joshua Wong was in Washington, D.C. This was from 2015. So you remember there were protests in 2014, actually, the umbrella movement, and Joshua Wong was part of that. That's where he got his start. And the next year, they reward him by inviting him to Washington, D.C. to get this award from Freedom House. The Freedom House is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy. So it's so obvious. I mean, for years and years, they had been cultivating him. And before Joshua Wong, it was this guy, Martin Lee. And then Benny Tai was also in there, but played a much more minor role. And this is what the U.S. was doing in Hong Kong the whole time. And I think a lot of people remember the U.S. flatly denying that they had any involvement at all with the Hong Kong protests, and that, a visit like this by Joshua Wong to Washington was insignificant. But that now we found out that yes, they were funding everything. Joshua Wong literally went to Washington, D.C., begging for help from the U.S. at the very end, right before the protests ended. So yes, they're going to jail, and some of them might face very severe penalties for colluding with foreign powers, for colluding with the United States government. And just think if it was the other way around, if China was doing this to the US and it turned out that China was behind violent protests that were beating people, destroying cities. What if we found that out? What if we found out the leaders of those protests were hanging out in Beijing and getting awards from the Chinese government? The US would never accept that. And China doesn't accept that. And one last thing before I wrap this up, I would like to talk about what they're calling the Hong Kong model here in Thailand. So these protesters here in Thailand, they openly link themselves to the Hong Kong protest. The protest leaders here, let's just take a look. Penguin, Joshua Wong. Let's see. We could get a good picture of him. Yeah, that's Penguin. He's one of the protest leaders here in Thailand. This is him in Hong Kong, side by side with Joshua Wong. Here's the billionaire opposition party leader Thanathorn. He's in Hong Kong, side by side with Joshua Wong. He was a member of the Thai government briefly as a member of parliament, and the Chinese government actually had to lodge an official protest over him associating with Joshua Wong because it was interfering in China's internal political affairs. And so the protesters here in Thailand talk about the Hong Kong model. They want to use the Hong Kong model to overthrow the Thai government, which look at how the Hong Kong model worked. It didn't work. They're all going to jail. So what I suggest is if the protesters here want to use the Hong Kong model to stir up trouble, I think the Thai government should consider certain aspects of the Beijing model for getting things back under control. And I think putting these leaders in prison for colluding with foreign powers, for these NGOs, for taking US government money and stirring up trouble in this country, I think that would be very appropriate. The US would never tolerate anyone doing it to them. So countries that the US is doing it to, they shouldn't tolerate it either. So anyway, thank you for watching this. If you're a patron, thank you very much for believing in my work and supporting it. I'm going to continue doing these reviews every day. I like to do them, and I hope you enjoy them. And please give feedback. And if you're watching this when this is posted publicly, please like and share it, and check the video description for references and for links if you're interested in supporting my work. And thank you for watching.